Genesis 6 contains a short phrase that seems too small to bear the weight of what it suggests. 4 verses, about 80 words in the original Hebrew, open an interpretive wound that runs through the entire Bible without ever fully healing. It mentions the sons of God, the daughters of men, and creatures called Nephilim, and then, almost like a footnote, adds 3 words that change everything, and also afterward. Is it a metaphor, a distorted historical memory, or an attempt to record something that did not fit into the common language of the time? If you stay until the end, you will understand why this line connects Genesis, Numbers, the conquest of Canaan, and the wars of David, finally echoing in the prophecies of the end, a pattern that repeats at key moments of the biblical narrative where it should not repeat. If you want investigations like this, which follow the complete textual chain without skipping the difficult problems, leave a like now. This pushes the video to more people who think like you, and hit the bell icon, because the next investigation will connect these giants with the Megaliths of Baalbek. Today, we are going to map every appearance of giants in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation. We are not doing systematic theology or selling a theory. We are following the text in the order it appears, seeing what each passage actually says, separating direct statements from later interpretations, and identifying the pattern that emerges when you put it all together. There are 3 takeaways at the end. First, the complete mapping. You will know exactly where each reference appears and what it says. Second, the theological pattern, why these creatures always appear at specific moments in biblical history. Third, the eschatological implications, what happens when you take the and also afterward seriously and follow it through to Revelation. We will open 4 questions that will be closed throughout the investigation. Why is Genesis 6 placed before the flood and not after? What did the spies see in Canaan that made them speak of the sons of Enoch? Why does Og, king of Bashan, have an iron bed mentioned with specific measurements? And why does Revelation use the language of fallen angels in the context of the final judgment? Genesis 6, 1-4 is ground zero. The Hebrew text is both economical and problematic. It says that when men began to multiply on the earth and daughters were born to them, the B'nai Elohim, literally sons of God or sons of the gods, depending on the vocalization and the theological context you assume, saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took for themselves wives from whomever they chose. The Lord then declares that his spirit will not strive with man forever, because he is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. And then comes the critical line, there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. 3 things are happening here that we cannot ignore. First, Nephilim is not a translation. It is a transliteration. The Hebrew root naphal means to fall, so Nephilim could be the fallen ones, or those who caused to fall. There is no consensus. The Greek Septuagint used giants, and it was this word that entered the Western tradition. Second, the text places Nephilim on the earth before the union of the sons of God with the daughters of men. But it also says that this union generated the mighty men, the Gibborim. This means that Nephilim and Gibborim might not be the same thing, or the text is using 2 names for the same group. Third, and most dangerous, and also afterward. After what? After the flood, which comes immediately in the following verses. If the flood was global and destroyed everything, how can there be Nephilim also afterward? The traditional Jewish reading, preserved in the Book of Enoch, an apocryphal but highly influential text in Second Temple Judaism, interprets sons of God as rebellious angels who descended to Mount Hermon, made a pact of transgression, and united with human women. Enoch calls these angels watchers and says they taught women sorcery and men the manufacture of weapons and cosmetics, and that their children, giants 3,000 cubits high according to the text, devoured all the production of humanity and began to devour one another. In this reading, the flood would have been a divine response not only to human wickedness, but to the genetic and cosmic corruption introduced by this forbidden union. This interpretation is attested in Jude 6:7 and 2 Peter 2:4, which speak of angels who did not keep their original state and are reserved for judgment. The alternative reading, which gained strength after the Council of Trent and became dominant in Reformed Protestantism, says that the sons of God are the lineage of Seth, the righteous descendants of Adam, and the daughters of men are the lineage of Cain, the wicked. The union would be a spiritual mixture between the righteous and the wicked, resulting in the moral corruption that provoked the flood. In this reading, Nephilim would merely be an archaic term for tyrants or violent men, and giants would be a later exaggerated interpretation. The problem with this reading is that it does not explain the and also afterward, It doesn't explain why the text uses such unusual language to describe what would just be mixed marriage. And it doesn't explain why Numbers 13, centuries later, uses the same word Nephilim for physically different creatures in Canaan. So let's go to Numbers 13. It is the episode of the spies. Moses sends 12 men to explore Canaan before the conquest. They return after 40 days with a cluster of grapes so large it needs to be carried by 2 men on a pole. But 10 of the spies bring bad news. And what do they say? There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. Note, they do not say generic giants. They use the specific word Nephilim, the same as in Genesis 6, and they connect these Nephilim to an actual genealogy, the sons of Anak. Numbers 13:33 creates a double problem. First, it confirms there were creatures in Canaan that the Israelites identified as Nephilim. Therefore, the "and also afterward" of Genesis 6 was not a figure of speech. It was a statement of continuity. Second, these creatures were not an ancient legend. They were alive, organized into clans, Anakites, and dominating specific territories. The size difference was so extreme that the spies described themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. Is this just rhetorical exaggeration from those who were afraid? It could be. But then comes Deuteronomy, which is where the pattern begins to become archaeologically verifiable. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 are the chapters of the Transjordanian conquest, the territories east of the Jordan that Israel conquers before entering Canaan. And here, the giants gain names, territories, and even measurements. Deuteronomy 2:10-11 says, "The Emim had dwelt there in times past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. They were also regarded as Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites call them Emim." Verses 20-21. That was also regarded as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly dwelt there. But the Ammonites call them Zamzumim, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them from before them. What is happening here? The text is cataloging at least 4 different names. Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, that overlap. Rephaim seems to be the umbrella term. Anakim are a subgroup. Emim and Zamzumim are local names for Rephaite groups. But most importantly, these groups controlled real territories before Israel arrived. The Moabites and Ammonites, according to the text, conquered these territories from the giants before Israel conquered them from the Moabites and Ammonites. This creates a chronology. Giants were there first. They were displaced by normal nations, which were then displaced by Israel. This is not a foundational myth. It is a history of territorial succession. And then we come to Og, king of Bashan, Deuteronomy 3. 11 is one of the most specific passages in all of the Bible about giants. For only Og, king of Bashan, remained of the remnant of the Rephaim. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead. Is it not in Rabbah of the people of Ammon? 9 cubits is its length, and 4 cubits its width, according to the standard cubit. A cubit is approximately 45 centimeters. 9 cubits equals 4 meters in length. 4 cubits is 1 meter and 80 centimeters wide. The text does not say Og was 4 meters tall. It says his bed was that length. If you assume a bed proportional to the body, Og would have been between 270 and 30 meters tall, depending on how much extra space you leave in a bed. Why does this measurement matter? Because it is verifiable. The text says the bed was in Rabbah of the people of Ammon, meaning it was a concrete artifact on display that could be seen. It's not, they say there was a giant. It is the last of the Rephaim was killed here, and his bed is on display in Rabbah. This is either precise historical memory or deliberate fraud. There is no middle ground. And fraud is unlikely because the text doesn't need to give measurements. It could simply say Og was huge and stop there. Giving specific measurements and the location of the artifact is an invitation to verification. Bashan, the kingdom of Og, is another marker. Bashan was located northeast of the Sea of Galilee, in a region known for having megaliths, huge stone structures, including dolmens, stone tables that still exist today. Psalm 22:12 uses bulls of Bashan as a metaphor for powerful enemies. Isaiah 2:13 mentions cedars of Lebanon and oaks of Bashan in the same context of tall things that will be brought low on the day of the Lord. Bashan was synonymous with strength, height, and abundance. If Og was the last of the Rephaim, and this suggests that Bashan was a Rephate territory par excellence, and that Israel eliminated the last representative of this group when conquering the region. But the Rephaim do not end with Og. The conquest of Canaan, narrated in Joshua, is full of references to Anakim and other giant groups. Joshua 11:21-22 says, "At that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. This verse does three things. It confirms that the Anakim were real and dominated strategic territories, mountains, fortresses. It states they were exterminated in a military campaign, and it says survivors fled to the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Why does this matter? Because Gath, centuries later, is the city of Goliath, and Goliath is explicitly identified as a Rephate in 2 Samuel 21, 16-22, in a passage that lists the sons of the giant killed by David and his mighty men. The Hebrew text uses Harapha, the Rapha, a singular version of Rephaim. Goliath was not an isolated giant. He had brothers, cousins, relatives, all described as enormous warriors, descendants of the same group. 1 Samuel 17:4 gives Goliath's height, 6 cubits in a span. That is approximately 290 meters according to the Masoretic text. Some manuscripts of the Septuagint and the Qumran fragments give 4 cubits in a span, which would be 2.06 meters. Even in the shorter version, Goliath would be a meter taller than the average of the time. And here the strategic pattern enters. Giants do not appear randomly in the biblical narrative. They always appear as military obstacles at moments of expansion or consolidation for the people of Israel. Genesis 6, before the flood, at the reset of humanity. Numbers 13, before entering Canaan, when the people must decide whether to conquer or not. Deuteronomy 2-3, during the Transjordanian conquest when Israel faces established kingdoms. Joshua 11, during the conquest of Canaan in strategic mountainous regions. 1 Samuel 17, when the Philistines threaten Israel and the people need a king to fight their battles. Each appearance marks an existential or military crisis. They are not narrative decoration. They are key adversaries. David kills Goliath with a sling and a stone, then decapitates him with the giant's own sword. But Goliath is not the last. 2 Samuel 21. 15:22 records 4 subsequent battles against the sons of the giant in Gath. First, Ishbi-Benob, who had a spear weighing 300 shekels of bronze and was girded with a new sword, tried to kill David. Abishai came to his aid and killed the Philistine. Then Sibbecai killed Saph, who was of the sons of the giant. Then Elhanan killed the brother of Goliath, named Lami, whose spear shaft was like a weaver's beam. Finally, a man of great stature who had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in all, was killed by Jonathan, David's nephew. The text ends with, "These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants." 24 digits. 6 fingers per hand is polydactyly, a real genetic condition that appears in certain lineages more frequently than in the general population. The text is not inventing this as a fantastic detail. It is recording a verifiable characteristic of a specific adversary. And note, all these giants are in Gath, the city where the surviving Anakim fled according to Joshua 11. The text is connecting the dots. Anakim, Rephaim, survivors in Gath, Goliath and his brothers. It is not a chain of myths. It is a chain of family and territorial succession. And then the giants leave the historical narrative. After 2 Samuel 21, there are no more recorded battles with giants in the Bible. They appear in retrospect. 1 Chronicles repeats the same stories, and in prophetic metaphor. But why do they disappear? One possible reading. They were exterminated. Og was the last of the Rephaim in Bashan. The Anakim were exterminated from the land of Israel. The survivors in Gath were killed by David and his men. If you read this as history, you have a record of selective genocide. Israel systematically eliminated a specific population that dominated strategic territories and represented a disproportionate military threat. Another reading. Giants are a theological category, not a biological one. They represent cosmic opposition to God's plan, and their elimination represents God's victory over powers that try to corrupt or impede his creation. In this reading, the physical details, height, strength, polydactyly, are real, but the meaning is greater than biology. They are visible signs of something invisible, the presence of forces contrary to the ordered cosmos that God is establishing through Israel. That is why they always appear at key moments, because these are the moments when cosmic conflict becomes historical conflict. Now let's look at the prophecies. Isaiah 26:14 says, speaking of Israel's enemies, "They are dead, they will not live. They are shadows, they will not rise. Therefore you have punished and destroyed them and made all their memory to perish." The Hebrew word translated as shadows is Rephaim, the same root as Rephaim, so the giants. Literally, they are Rephaim, they will not rise. This could be just a metaphorical use of an ancient word for dead or spirits, but the context is divine judgment against nations that oppressed Israel. And if you connect this with Genesis 6 and Numbers 13, A more sinister reading emerges. The Rephaim didn't just die, they were prevented from rising. Their fate is permanent elimination, not just temporary death. Isaiah 14, the famous passage about the fall of the king of Babylon, which is read Christologically as the fall of Lucifer, uses language of day star, son of the morning, who, fallen from heaven and wanted to exalt my throne above the stars of God and be like the Most High. You can read this as a metaphor for human pride, but the language of falling from heaven echoes Nephilim, the fallen ones. And ascending above the stars of God echoes Enoch 60:7, where the watchers descend and transgress their cosmic position. If you allow Genesis 6 to inform the reading of Isaiah 14, the text is not just about Babylon, it is about a pattern. Beings who try to cross established boundaries, produce corruption, and are permanently judged. Ezekiel 32 is even more direct. It is a lament over Pharaoh in Egypt, but verses 27 to 28 say, "They do not lie with the mighty who are fallen of the uncircumcised, who went down to Sheol with their weapons of war. They have laid their swords under their heads, but their iniquities will be on their bones, because of the terror of the mighty in the land of the living." Mighty who are fallen, the Hebrew word is gibberim, the same used in Genesis 6:4 for the sons of the Nephilim. Ezekiel is placing Pharaoh on the same plane as the ancient giants, defeated, buried, but still remembered as a terror in the land of the living. Do you want to know something fascinating? Comment below. Do you read these passages as metaphor, as distorted historical memory, or as a mixed record? Real events interpreted theologically. And why? No fighting, just curiosity. So we come to the New Testament, and the pattern returns, but now in apocalyptic language. Jude 6:7 is the most explicit. "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day. As Sodom and Gomorrah, and the cities around them in a similar manner to these, having given themselves over to sexual immorality and gone after strange flesh, are set forth as an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." Angels who left their abode, fornication with strange flesh, imprisonment until the great day of judgment. This is not a metaphor. It is a direct reference to the tradition of Genesis 6 and Enoch. Jude is saying that the event of Genesis 6 was so grave that these angels were permanently imprisoned, awaiting final judgment. 2 Peter 2:4-5 says the same thing. "For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly." Angels who sinned cast into Tartarus, the Greek word used here, not common Hades, held until judgment, and it is immediately connected to the flood. Peter is saying that the flood was a response to the sin of the angels, not just of men. And if the angels are imprisoned until judgment, this implies that their judgment hasn't happened yet. It is future, eschatological. Revelation does not mention giants physically, but it mentions angels of Satan, the dragon and his angels, and a war in heaven where Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. Revelation 12:7-9. Cast out, precipitado, the root is the same as to fall. And angels cast out with him echoes Jude and 2 Peter. Revelation 9 describes creatures that come out of the abyss when the 5th angel sounds the trumpet. "Then out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and to them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they had, as king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon." These creatures are not natural locusts. They have faces like human faces, hair like women's hair, teeth like lions' teeth, breastplates like breastplates of iron. They cannot kill, but they can torment for 5 months. And they have a king, an angel of the abyss, whose name means destroyer. If you connect this with Genesis 6, Jude, and 2 Peter, a reading emerges. These creatures are either spiritual descendants or manifestations of the beings who were imprisoned. The abyss is where the fallen angels were cast. And at the end of time, they are temporarily released as an instrument of judgment. Revelation 20:1-3 speaks of the dragon, Satan, being cast into the abyss, sealed for 1,000 years, and then released for a short time. The same abyss. If this abyss already contained the angels of Genesis 6, Satan is being placed in the same spot. And when he is released, he deceives the nations in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, gathering them for battle. Gog and Magog are references to Ezekiel 38:39, a prophecy about an invasion from the north against Israel. But the name Magog appears in Genesis 10 as a son of Japheth. And in some Jewish traditions, Magog is connected to giants or northern nations descended from pre-flood groups. So what is happening? If you connect all the dots, a narrative arc emerges that traverses the entire Bible. Genesis 6 describes a cosmic transgression that produces Nephilim and corruption. The flood eliminates the original Nephilim, and also afterward indicates that something survived or resurfaced. Numbers in Deuteronomy show later descendants or manifestations, the Rephaim, Anakim in Canaan and adjacent territories. The conquest by Israel is presented as an elimination of these groups, not just a seizure of land. David finalizes the lineage by killing the last giants in Gath. The prophecies use the language of Rephaim and Gibberim to describe judgment against proud nations. The New Testament confirms that there was an angelic transgression in Genesis 6, that these angels are imprisoned, and that their final judgment is yet to come. And Revelation describes the temporary release of beings from the abyss at the end of time, connecting them to the same pattern of cosmic opposition. This doesn't prove that literal 4-meter giants walked the earth, but it proves that the biblical text has a consistent narrative thread on this theme, which cannot be reduced to they are just myths without ignoring entire passages. If it is a metaphor that persists through 2,000 years of text, crosses multiple literary genres, and is treated as real by the authors of the New Testament. If it is historical memory, it is memory that points to traumatic events, invasions, confrontations with physically different populations, and the systematic elimination of these populations as an existential threat. And then there is the hermeneutical question that no one wants to touch. What do you do with a text that claims something improbable but not impossible? 3-meter giants are biologically possible. Acromegaly, pituitary gigantism, and other conditions can produce people from 250 to 280 meters. 3 meters is extreme, but within known human variation. Entire clans of giants are unlikely, but possible, if there was genetic isolation and specific conditions. Angelic transgression is theologically problematic, but the text states it directly. You can reject it as mythology. But then you need to explain why New Testament authors treat Genesis 6 as a real event, why Jude cites Enoch as an authority, and why Peter connects fallen angels to the flood. The conventional academic explanation is that Genesis 6 reflects adapted Mesopotamian myths, stories of gods descending, demigods, ancient heroes. Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, they all have similar elements, and Israel, living in a Canaanite context, would have absorbed and reinterpreted these stories to teach monotheistic theology. In this reading, it doesn't matter if giants were real. What matters is what the story teaches, that pride produces a fall, that transgression has consequences, that God judges corruption. The details are mythological, the meaning is true. The problem with this reading is that it does not explain why Deuteronomy gives measurements, why Joshua records specific military campaigns against specific groups, and why 2 Samuel describes individual battles with names and verifiable characteristics. Myth does not need polydactyly. Myth does not need an iron bed in Rabbah. Myth does not need survivors in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. This is either deliberate fraud, inventing details to make myth look like history, or it is historical memory preserved because the events were significant enough to be remembered. And there is the question of megalithic architecture. Baalbek, in Lebanon, has stone blocks of 800 tons. Göbekli Tepe, in Turkey, has T-shaped pillars 11 meters tall dating to 10,000 years BC, before agriculture, before cities. Sacsayhuaman, in Peru, has joints so precise that a blade cannot fit between the stones. These structures do not prove giants, but they prove that ancient cultures had technical capacity that we do not fully understand. And if you allow Genesis 6 and Numbers 13 to inform your investigation, you begin to ask, why are these structures in regions that the biblical text associates with giants or pre-flood events? Mount Hermon, for example, lies exactly on the border between Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It is the highest point in the region, 814 meters. Enoch says the watchers descended there and made their pact, Deuteronomy 3. 9 mentions Hermon by the names the Sidonians and Amorites gave it, Syrian and Sanir. Psalm 133:3 says, as the dew of Hermon, descending upon the mountains of Zion. It is a geographically real mountain, with multiple preserved names, textually connected to the event of Genesis 6. It doesn't prove fallen angels, but it shows that cultural memory associated that specific place with the specific event. Why? If it's just a myth, why anchor it in verifiable, real geography? And then you arrive in Bashan. Bashan was the land of Og, the last of the Rephaim. Bashan lies northeast of the Sea of Galilee in a region called the Golan today, and the Golan is full of dolmens, megalithic structures, stone burial chambers, thousands of them. Some have 50-ton blocks, They date to the Bronze Age. Who built them? Conventional archaeology says local tribes using ramps and collective labor. Possible. But why so many, so large, in a relatively small region? And why does the biblical text associate this region with eliminated giants? You could say coincidence, or you could say the text is preserving a memory that the populations who built these structures were physically different and were displaced by conquest. It doesn't prove 4-meter giants, but it suggests that Rephaim may have been the name Israel gave to populations that mastered megalithic construction techniques, were territorially entrenched in strategic mountainous regions, and represented a significant military obstacle. The exaggerated physical height may have been part legend, part reality, acromegalic individuals used as elite warriors, and part military propaganda. Enemies always seem bigger. But what about the theological pattern? Why do these populations always appear at key moments? Here enters a reading that tries to reconcile history and theology. If you accept that Israel had a worldview where boundaries between the natural and supernatural were porous, then giants can be both a physical phenomenon and a spiritual marker. They are real, genetically distinct populations with physical advantages, advanced construction techniques, and territorial dominance, and they are symbolic, representatives of cosmic forces that oppose God's plan, whether by original angelic transgression, Genesis 6, by cultural heritage of that transgression, or by spiritual alignment with contrary powers. In this reading, Og is not just a tall king. He is the representative of a lineage that stretches back to Genesis 6, which dominates megalithic territories, and whose elimination marks Israel's victory over the last vestige of the pre-flood world in Canaan. Goliath is not just a large warrior. He is a descendant of the Anakim who fled from Joshua, a survivor of a group that should have been exterminated, and whose challenge to Israel represents not just a military threat, but a cosmic challenge. We are still here. When David kills him, it is not just a military victory. It is the closing of a cycle. The last representative of the giants falls by the hand of the king chosen by God. And that is why the prophecies use Rephaim as a symbol of permanent judgment. Isaiah 26 doesn't just say Israel's enemies will die. It says they are Rephaim, they will not rise. In other words, their fate is the same as that of the giants, elimination without return. Ezekiel 32 doesn't just say Pharaoh will be defeated. It says he will lie with the fallen Gibborim, the ancient warriors. In other words, his fall is as definitive as the fall of the ancient powers. The language of giants becomes the language of irreversible judgment. And when you get to Revelation, the cycle is complete. If the angels who transgressed in Genesis 6 are imprisoned awaiting final judgment, and if Revelation describes a war in heaven where Satan and his angels are cast to earth, and if it then describes creatures coming out of the abyss, then the "and also afterward" of Genesis 6 was not just about the post-flood period, it was prophetic. It was about the pattern that would repeat at the end of time: transgression, corruption, judgment. Revelation is, in this reading, the final Genesis 6, the last manifestation of the conflict that began before the flood, and that only ends with the New Jerusalem descending from heaven when there is no more sea, Revelation 21:1. And the sea, in Hebrew cosmology, is the place of chaos, of adverse powers, of Leviathan. So, the 3 takeaways promised at the beginning. First, the complete mapping. Giants appear in Genesis 6 as Nephilim, the product of the union of sons of God and daughters of men. They reappear in Numbers 13 as Nephilim and sons of Enoch in Canaan. Deuteronomy 2-3 catalogs Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, and Og as distinct but related groups. Joshua 11 records a campaign of extermination against the Anakim, with survivors fleeing to Philistine cities. 1 Samuel 17 and so. Samuel 21 describe Goliath and his brothers as the last representatives in Gath. Isaiah and Ezekiel use Rephaim and Gibborim as the language of judgment. Jude and 2 Peter connect Genesis 6 to imprisoned fallen angels. Revelation describes celestial war and the release of creatures from the abyss, closing the cycle. Second, the theological pattern. Giants do not appear randomly. They appear in moments of existential crisis. Before the flood, the reset of creation. Before the conquest of Canaan, the establishment of Israel in the Promised Land. During the wars of consolidation, David eliminating threats to the monarchy. And at the end of time, the final judgment. Each appearance marks a confrontation between divine order and forces that try to corrupt or challenge it. They are obstacles that must be removed for God's plan to move forward. Their elimination is not just military. It is theological. It is an affirmation that God has authority over powers that transgressed cosmic boundaries. Third, the eschatological implications. If Genesis 6 is a real event, then there is a precedent for angelic transgression with physical consequences. If the angels who transgressed are imprisoned awaiting judgment, then part of the final judgment will involve not just humans, but spiritual beings. If Revelation describes the temporary release of these beings before the end, then there will be a recapitulation of the Genesis 6 pattern: corruption, chaos, divine intervention, judgment. And if the physical giants were eliminated, but the spiritual structure behind them continues until Revelation, then the battle is not just about land or genealogy, it is cosmic. It is about who rules creation. What you do with this depends on how you weigh the evidence. If you privilege modern rationalism, you will say giants were tall people with genetic conditions. Genesis 6 is adapted mythology, and the rest is theological expansion over distorted memories. That is legitimate. But you need to explain the details that wouldn't need to be there if it were just myth. If you privilege the text as testimony, you will say there were real events that generated these memories, and although we cannot reconstruct exactly what happened, the narrative pattern is too consistent to be discarded. Also legitimate. And if you allow ancient text, megalithic archaeology, and physical anomalies to converse without prior commitment, you are left with better questions. Why do so many separate cultures have stories of giants? Why do these stories connect to megalithic structures that we don't know how were built? Why does the biblical text treat the theme with historical seriousness in some places and symbolic seriousness in others, and sometimes mixes the two? The honest answer is, we don't know. We know what the text says. We know that ancient populations built impressive things. We know that there are people with conditions that produce extreme height. We know that Israel entered Canaan and faced military resistance from groups entrenched in specific territories. We know that these groups were eliminated and that the text preserved names, genealogies, and locations. We know that New Testament authors treated Genesis 6 as a real event with eschatological implications. And we know that Revelation describes the judgment of angels and the release of creatures from the abyss. If literal giants walked the earth, they were eliminated and left no living descendants today. If they were populations with distinctive physical characteristics and advanced techniques, their structures still exist, but their culture was absorbed or destroyed. If they were a theological category used to describe cosmic opposition, the category still works in Revelation because the conflict has not yet ended, or all of these at once. Real events interpreted theologically because the real and the theological were not separate in the ancient worldview. What remains standing after mapping all the appearances? It remains that the biblical text has a continuous narrative about giants, which begins in Genesis 6, crosses the history of Israel, and ends in Revelation. This narrative is not decorative. It structures key moments. It connects transgression to judgment, pride to a fall, physical corruption to spiritual corruption. And it leaves a promise that what was partially eliminated during the conquest will be definitively eliminated at the end of time. Revelation 20:10 says the devil will be cast into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet already are, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Revelation 20:14-15 says that death and Hades will be cast into the lake of fire, and anyone whose name is not found in the book of life as well. The abyss where the fallen angels were cast is not the final destination. The final destination is permanent elimination. If you want more investigations like this, which map complete biblical themes without selling easy certainties, subscribe to the channel now and hit the bell. And leave in the comments, which theme do you want us to investigate with this depth? The flood and world cultures? Babel and the origin of languages? Sodom and the archaeology of the Dead Sea? The next script will be based on what you want to see. Thanks for making it this far. The "and also afterward" of Genesis 6 is not a bug in the text. It's a feature. It is the admission that something crossed the flood, whether lineage, memory, or spiritual pattern, and that something continues until Revelation, where the cycle finally closes. Nephilim, Rephaim, Anakim, Gibberim, different names for the same marker, and the marker says there was a confrontation, there was an elimination, and there will be a final elimination. The story of the giants is not about height. It is about what happens when boundaries are transgressed, when powers rebel, and when God decides that the conflict is over. It is about who rules creation. And according to the text, from Genesis to Revelation, the answer never changes.